In 1789, in the twisting, fog-laden alleys of London, a child was born whose existence would ripple through Thessaly like a shadow that refused to fade. Thomas Wren, the unassuming boy with eyes that never closed, became an obsession of whispers, fear, and fascination. Neighbors claimed that even as an infant, his gaze seemed to penetrate walls, corners, and secrets that no one else could perceive. Some said he stared into the void, observing realities hidden to the common eye. Others whispered that his unblinking stare heralded tragedy, a mark of some dark fate inscribed upon him before he had even drawn breath. Physicians attempted to measure, to diagnose, to rationalize, yet their instruments and knowledge failed against a phenomenon that defied natural explanation. Moral philosophers debated his soul, questioning whether innocence and malevolence could coexist in one child. Occultists proclaimed him touched by forces beyond comprehension, a vessel of prophecy or curse. The city itself seemed to react to his presence. Animals recoiled, neighbors averted their gaze, and rumors spread like wildfire, each tale more horrifying than the last. Even within his own home, Thomas became a paradox, cherished by some, feared by others. Families who dared to visit claimed an oppressive intensity in his stare, a silent judgment that unsettled even the most devout. Clergy argued endlessly about the state of his soul, the potential for redemption, or the necessity of exorcism. Scholars recorded his life meticulously, yet the records themselves grew contradictory, blending factual observation with folklore until it became impossible to distinguish one from the other. Street urchins swore he could see their hidden mischief. Servants whispered of knowing glances that anticipated their movements, and midwives described a gaze that refused to rest, as though the boy were awake in places no human could follow. The markets and pubs, stories grew darker, fueled by superstition and the human impulse to explain the inexplicable. Thomas's story, though rooted in history, borders on myth. Diaries, pamphlets, and letters preserved his memory, recounting eerie anecdotes that blur the line between witness and imagination. Some claim he predicted events no one else could have foreseen. Others insist calamities followed him wherever he walked. The very air around him seemed charged with tension, as though the city itself recognized that he carried a secret too immense for ordinary perception. Was he merely a victim of circumstance? A child born with a rare neurological anomaly amplified by societal fear? Or was there something far more sinister at play? A consciousness that glimpsed truths beyond human comprehension, a moral observer, or an omen of calamity yet to unfold? The accounts of Thomas's eyes, constant, unblinking, and unnerving, are more than a medical curiosity. They are the first clue in a story that challenges every assumption about human nature, morality, and fear. His existence forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we perceive evil? Can innocence and menace coexist? And when confronted with the inexplicable, what part of ourselves do we see reflected in the gaze of another? Tonight, we journey into the life of Thomas Wren, a boy whose eyes never closed, whose stare unsettled a city, and whose story refuses to leave the shadows, lingering in every corner of history and human imagination. Thomas Wren entered the world in 1789, in a modest London home tucked deep within a labyrinth of narrow alleys, where fog clung to the cobblestones and gas lamps cast trembling shadows that danced across soot-stained brick. From the moment of his birth, something about him defied expectation, something that drew Eunice as much as fascination. Midwives and neighbors alike recalled, with a mixture of awe and terror, that his eyes opened immediately after he emerged into the world, unblinking and unnervingly intense. Those eyes did not simply look, they seemed to penetrate, to examine not only the physical space but the intentions and hidden fears of all who dared meet them. Even in infancy, Thomas's gaze appeared to carry knowledge beyond his years, and neighbors began speaking of him in whispers that wove together fear, wonder, and speculation. Some claimed he could sense approaching misfortune, predicting fires, illness, or petty thefts before anyone else noticed, while others suggested darker forces at work, that the boy carried a curse, a portent, or a divine message too heavy for ordinary mortals to bear. From his first breaths, he became a figure of paradox. entirely innocent in body, yet laden with an aura that unsettled those around him, a child whose very existence blurred the line between ordinary life and ominous portent. Medical attention arrived early, and Thomas's parents sought reassurance, hoping that the explanations of physicians would alleviate the growing unease. Instead, the medical records and professional accounts only deepened the mystery. Some doctors, examining his eyes and nocturnal behavior, claimed to observe a rare congenital condition, a neurological anomaly that prevented eyelids from closing properly and disrupted normal sleep cycles. Others offered more extraordinary theories. One physician suggested that Thomas's eyes were a vessel for forces beyond human comprehension, while moral philosophers debated whether the boy's gaze indicated divine purpose or moral consequence. Clergy became involved as well, some insisting that Thomas's condition was a sign of spiritual favor, while others feared that his unblinking stare was an omen of corruption, a moral test for those who looked upon him. London, a city of superstition, and rational enlightenment side by side, became a stage where reason and fear collided, each attempt to classify Thomas only increasing public fascination and dread. Within the family, life unfolded under a delicate and ever-tense balance. Thomas's parents, ordinary Londoners with modest means, struggled to protect their child from the prying eyes of neighbors, preachers, and medical authorities. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and the child's exposure to the public minimized, yet the stories of his extraordinary eyes inevitably spread. Children in the alleys whispered of the boy who never slept, who could see into the intentions of others, and these tales reached the ears of adults, amplifying fear. Servants in the household reported unease, recounting how the infant seemed aware of their movements, predicting mistakes or accidents before they occurred, as if observing not only the present but some unseen future. Such accounts, though mundane at first glance, fed into a growing mythology around Thomas, framing him simultaneously as a marvel, a burden, and a threat. The paradox of innocence and suspicion became apparent early, while Thomas himself displayed the behaviors of any infant, crying, laughing, responding to comfort. His unblinking eyes transformed these ordinary acts into something uncanny. Visitors left the home unnerved, describing sensations that could not be explained by ordinary interaction. Clergy debated his soul, physicians debated his physiology, and neighbors debated the moral implications of harboring such a child in their midst. Some feared that prolonged exposure to Thomas's gaze might reveal hidden sins, punish the guilty, or even influence mental stability. Others marveled, suggesting that perhaps this child was gifted with insight into truths beyond ordinary perception, a silent witness to the hidden machinations of the human world. As he grew, Thomas's unusual condition shaped every aspect of his upbringing. His parents attempted to provide care, affection, and a semblance of normalcy, yet the omnipresent gaze, both theirs and the world's, imposed pressures far beyond that of ordinary childhood. Diaries and letters from neighbors and acquaintances recount episodes of intense scrutiny, of moments where Thomas seemed to anticipate danger, identify dishonesty, or react to phenomena invisible to others. The accounts are consistent. Adults experienced unease, their own fears and guilt amplified by the perception of being observed. In this, the boy's early life was not simply a story of anomaly. It was a reflection of human psychology itself, illustrating how fear, projection, and social tension can transform a natural difference into a living legend. The interplay between nurture and nature was a constant theme. Thomas's parents, protective, yet constrained by social pressures, oscillated between attempting to shelter him from public gaze and seeking expert counsel to ensure his health and safety. Physicians, moralists, and clergy alike visited the home, bringing both reassurance and fear, amplifying the tension between care and suspicion. The broader community, unsure whether to fear, pity, or study the child, contributed to the weight of expectation. Every glance, every encounter, every whispered rumor reinforced the idea that Thomas's very presence carried consequences beyond ordinary understanding. In a world where superstition mingled with rational thought, and where morality was scrutinized alongside physiology, Thomas became a nexus of human curiosity, anxiety, and imagination. Public reaction escalated with each passing year. Children in the neighborhood began reporting visions and warnings that Thomas supposedly delivered in his cryptic gaze. Adults, from merchants to clergy, noted increased tension, whispering that misfortune seemed to follow in the boy's path. Even minor incidents, a misplaced object, a small fire, or an accident, were attributed to the unblinking eyes, reinforcing the narrative of a child whose very existence invoked awe and terror. Skeptics argued for coincidence, for psychological projection, or for hysteria amplified by rumor. Yet the cultural impression was undeniable. Thomas was no ordinary child. He was a mirror for Thessaly's deepest fears, a symbol of the unknown, and an object lesson in the fragility of human interpretation when confronted by phenomena beyond comprehension. By the end of his early childhood, Thomas Wren had become both a subject of fascination and a locus of anxiety. His eyes, unblinking and unnerving, had drawn the attention of neighbors, physicians, clergy, and philosophers alike. He was celebrated, feared, studied, and whispered about in equal measure. He existed in a world that oscillated between empathy and dread, curiosity and superstition, innocence and latent menace. Every interaction, every observation, every rumor layered additional complexity onto the story of his life, creating a tapestry of fear, fascination, and uncertainty that would set the stage for the extraordinary events and psychological debates that followed. In every glance, in every unblinking stare, Thomas Wren became more than a child. He became a symbol, a living enigma, and the starting point of a story that would haunt London for decades, forcing all who encountered him to confront the boundary between the natural and the inexplicable, the innocent and the potentially sinister. As Thomas Wren grew, the unblinking intensity of his eyes became more than a childhood curiosity. It became a catalyst for unease that rippled through the streets of London. The narrow alleyways, thick with fog and soot, seemed to shudder in his presence, and locals began to whisper about the strange phenomena that followed him. Children playing in the courtyards claimed that he spoke of visions no adult could perceive, uttering words that were dismissed as childish nonsense, yet hinted at a knowledge beyond his years. Dogs recoiled from him, cats hissed and fled, and even horses pulling carriages balked at his approach. Those who crossed his path reported sudden chills, unexplained shivers, and moments of vertigo, experiences that science at the time struggled to explain. The combination of unblinking eyes and these subtle disturbances created a tension that was almost palpable, a living reminder that the ordinary world could conceal the extraordinary, and that perception itself was fragile and unreliable. Rumors began to circulate quickly, fueled by the natural human desire to explain the inexplicable. Fires that broke out in alleyways, petty thefts, sudden illnesses, and minor accidents were all traced back, often without evidence, to the gaze of young Thomas. Some neighbors swore that their misfortune followed him, that even the smallest glance carried with it portent or harm. Others, more skeptical, attributed these occurrences to coincidence, hysteria, or the amplification of human anxiety in tightly knit communities where superstition mingled with daily struggle. Street preachers seized upon his presence, declaring that he was a child of prophecy, a vessel for divine warning, or a living embodiment of sin. Occultists, meanwhile, speculated that Thomas's gaze could pierce the veil between worlds, that he might be attuned to spirits, omens, or forces beyond mortal comprehension. Each claim, true or false, reinforced the perception that Thomas was an ordinary child, and that his eyes were a mirror reflecting the fears, guilt, and imaginations of all who encountered him. Reports of unusual events accumulated, creating a patchwork of accounts that was difficult to verify yet impossible to ignore. One widow claimed that her daughter fell ill after Thomas passed by their home, asserting that the boy had looked into her very soul. A merchant reported that his wares mysteriously vanished the same day he had a brief interaction with the child, attributing the theft to an inexplicable influence rather than human mischief. And yet, skeptics, physicians, magistrates, and rationalist thinkers argued that the coincidences were exactly that. Coincidences, magnified by the superstitious tendencies of a city still steeped in religious fervor and folklore. The tension between empirical reasoning and popular belief became a defining feature of Thomas's adolescence, a collision of two worlds that could not reconcile the simple fact of his existence with the extraordinary reactions it provoked. Children, particularly, were drawn into the legend of the unblinking boy. They claimed that Thomas spoke of visions unseen by adults, describing details of events that had not yet occurred, or interpreting natural phenomena in ways that seemed impossible for his age. Some stories suggest that he predicted local accidents, fires, and illnesses, though records are inconsistent. Adults often dismiss these claims, but the repetition of tales across neighborhoods added to the growing aura of fear and fascination. Children's testimonies, in their unfiltered perception, became a central part of the myth, illustrating how innocence and imagination could amplify mystery. The line between reality and interpretation blurred, with human psychology playing a critical role. Projection, suggestion, and collective anxiety transformed Thomas from a curious anomaly into an urban legend in real time. As Thomas's reputation grew, so did the public spectacle around him. Street preachers would gather small crowds in marketplaces, pointing to the boy as proof of divine punishment or blessing, while occultists performed demonstrations of ritual and speculation to test whether his gaze could influence unseen forces. Some townsfolk approached cautiously, hoping to witness proof of prophecy or miracle. Others fled at even the hint of his presence, convinced that evil itself could manifest in Achild's stare. The city itself seemed complicit in the creation of legend, with alleys and foggy streets providing a theater for both observation and imagination. Every movement of the child, every glance, every uttered word became subject to interpretation, reinforcing the tension between human perception and objective reality. Medical observers continued to document the boy, though their notes reveal more about societal fear than physiological anomaly. One doctor noted that Thomas never slept for long periods, yet did not appear physically harmed by this lack of rest, suggesting a neurological or congenital anomaly. Others argued that the boy's condition was moral or spiritual in nature, a reflection of hidden sin, divine observation, or supernatural influence. The contrast between science and superstition deepened public fascination. Rationalists argued for natural causes, while clergy and mystics spoke in terms of morality, punishment, and cosmic design. Each claim added layers to the legend, transforming Thomas from an individual into a symbol, a focal point for anxieties about morality, fate, and human perception itself. Even the city's animals seemed attuned to his presence, reinforcing the narrative that he was somehow other. Cats hissed and retreated into alleyways, dogs whimpered and refused approach, and carriage horses balked unpredictably. Observers interpreted these reactions as evidence of latent malevolence or spiritual power, while others noted that animals often respond unpredictably to stimuli humans cannot perceive, introducing rational explanations to counter the mystique. Londoners, however, were not content with rationality alone. In a city rife with crime, superstition, and fear, the presence of a child who disrupted both physical and psychological norms became a focal point for collective anxiety. Rumors escalated further as Thomas aged, with stories of misfortune, illness, and minor calamity following his unblinking eyes. Families avoided him, whispering about curses, divine judgment, or moral corruption. He became both an object of empathy and fear. Innocence and latent evil intertwined. Clergy debated his soul, philosophers debated the ethics of public reaction, and ordinary citizens debated whether to intervene, avoid, or worship the phenomenon. Every encounter, every whispered story, and every observed reaction solidified the legend. Thomas Wren's existence forced the city to confront uncomfortable questions. Was human perception reliable? Was fear a tool of reason or a distortion of reality? Could one child, unassuming yet extraordinary, serve as a mirror to collective morality, superstition, and imagination? By the end of his childhood, the tension between public fear and private concern, between superstition and emerging scientific reasoning, had escalated to a fever pitch. Thomas's unblinking eyes had transformed him into a nexus for human anxiety, imagination, and interpretation. Stories of his gaze, the maladies it allegedly caused, and the insights he allegedly possessed spread beyond his neighborhood, entering newspapers, pamphlets, and even scholarly discussion. He became a cautionary tale, a symbol, and a source of Moral and psychological inquiry. In every whispered account, every street-side conversation, and every fearful glance, the boy's existence challenged the limits of human understanding. London itself became a theater for legend, and Thomas Wren, innocent yet uncanny, unblinking yet observant, became the lens through which the city examined its own fears, superstitions, and the fragile boundary between perception and reality. As Thomas Wren's reputation spread beyond the narrow alleyways of his neighborhood, a parade of observers descended upon London, each armed with their own interpretation, methods, and agenda. Physicians traveled from continental Europe, seeking to document what they called a medical anomaly, though many arrived expecting scandal rather than genuine insight. They examined him in dimly lit parlors, counting his blinks, or lack thereof, timing his sleep cycles, and measuring responses to stimuli that most children would encounter without consequence. Their notes, often contradictory, recorded neurological irregularities, chronic insomnia, and an intensity of focus that seemed almost inhuman. Some speculated that his unblinking gaze was caused by a rare congenital disorder, perhaps related to the ocular nerves, a condition that left him awake while others slept. Others proposed that the boy's peculiar physiology could result from psychological trauma or an undiagnosed mental disorder, a manifestation of stress or societal pressure, amplified by the attention he had attracted. Yet despite rigorous observation, no physician could fully explain Thomas. Each analysis, technical and precise in tone, inadvertently fueled speculation. If science could not account for the boy, then perhaps he belonged to a realm beyond understanding. Meanwhile, prophets, mystics, and self-proclaimed seers arrived, claiming access to knowledge beyond the empirical. They observed him in dim corners, whispered prayers, and held ritualistic seances, declaring that Thomas's eyes were windows to the soul and to a realm of truth that ordinary humans could not perceive. One medium from Paris swore that he had seen visions of future disasters reflected in the boy's gaze, while a London astrologer claimed that his birth coincided with a rare celestial alignment, marking him as a child of prophecy. Clergy and moral philosophers debated these claims in public forums and private salons, arguing over whether the boy's anomaly was a test of faith, a divine punishment, or a harbinger of doom. Each mystical interpretation, while unverifiable, captured the imagination of a city already primed to see omens in fog, crime, and disease. The tension between medical rationality and prophetic vision became central. Science sought patterns, causality, and evidence, while mysticism offered meaning, warning, and moral narrative. Families of the child became unwilling participants in this maelstrom. Neighbors whispered that his parents oscillated between pride and fear, admiration and anxiety. Some accounts suggest that they initially sought protection from physicians, hoping to understand and safeguard their son, while simultaneously consulting mystics, desperate for reassurance or insight into the potential danger he might represent. Relatives of Thomas faced moral and social pressure, judged for how they raised a child who was simultaneously innocent and uncanny, natural and unnatural. Their lives became entangled with the curiosity, fear, and expectation of a city that could not look away. Paradoxically, the more they tried to normalize his existence, the more public fascination and suspicion intensified. Reports of his behavior during observation sessions were varied and contradictory, reflecting the interpretive lens of each witness. A physician noted the boy's alertness as unnerving, describing his gaze as penetrating, almost accusatory, while a medium interpreted the same stare as a spiritual insight into unseen worlds. When questioned, Thomas often seemed indifferent, responding to stimuli with intelligence and clarity that confounded skeptics, yet occasionally slipping into moments of silence or apparent trance that mystics seized upon as evidence of otherworldly perception. Each account reinforced the duality at the heart of his legend. He was both a child and an enigma, real yet symbol, natural yet possibly supernatural. Public fascination escalated as the city watched every development. Newspapers chronicled the arrivals of doctors and mystics, reporting analyses, predictions, and moral debates. Headlines alternated between sober medical description, London boy with unblinking eyes examined by physicians, and sensationalistic warnings. Prophets claim child sees into the soul, foretells doom. Aristocrats, drawn by curiosity and fear, attended private viewings, commissioning private studies and even attempts at protection rituals. Scholars wrote treatises debating whether the boy's existence was an ethical test, a neurological curiosity, or evidence of a moral universe in which divine justice manifested in children. The dual lens of science and superstition gave Thomas a symbolic weight far beyond that of any ordinary child. His eyes, simple in their biological function, became an arena for society's confrontation with the unknown. The tension between reason and fear, curiosity and dread, innocence and latent threat. At the same time, ethical debates arose over how far investigators could intervene. Some physicians suggested isolation to prevent contagion of panic. Some prophets demanded proximity to access his powers. Parents were caught between protecting him and participating in the scrutiny. Letters and diaries indicate growing distress. Thomas sometimes recoiled from the attention, hiding in shadows, yet other times engaged with examiners, demonstrating remarkable cognitive abilities that contradicted any notion of defect. This ambiguity, this oscillation between ordinary child behavior and extraordinary interpretation, further polarized observers, reinforcing their biases. Physicians interpreted cooperation as adaptation to study. Mystics saw it as tacit acknowledgement of spiritual sensitivity. Every gesture became a Rorschach test for the expectations, fears, and desires of adults. Conflicting accounts multiplied the moral and intellectual tension, while empirical records recorded vital signs, sleep cycles, and responses to stimuli. Mystical reports claimed clairvoyance, spiritual insight, and a connection to cosmic events. Attempts to reconcile the two perspectives were largely futile. When physicians observed the boy and found no tangible anomalies beyond sleep deprivation and intense focus, mystics interpreted this as evidence of concealment, the boy guarding forbidden knowledge. Conversely, when unexplained phenomena were reported, objects moving, animals behaving strangely, sudden chills, scientists dismissed these as superstition or coincidence, while the public read these stories as confirmation of prophecy or supernatural influence. The inability of either camp to offer definitive answer cemented Thomas as a locus for fear, curiosity, and moral reflection. This intersection of science, mysticism, and public perception had profound social consequences. Children whispered about his powers, adults avoided Heim or sought him out for consultation, and moral philosophers debated whether society had an obligation to intervene. Schools faced pressure to include or exclude him. Clergy argued over his spiritual status, and neighbors oscillated between fascination and dread. Each encounter, each report, and each publicized interpretation further entrenched the duality that defined Thomas. He was both innocent and uncanny, a child and a symbol, a living being and a mirror reflecting human anxiety. By the end of his youth, Thomas Wren had become a cultural phenomenon, the subject of scientific papers, mystical treatises, moral debates, and street gossip. His eyes, unchanging, unblinking, intense, were no longer just a physiological anomaly, but a canvas upon which the city projected its fears, hopes, and interpretations. Physicians and prophets had transformed a single child into a nexus of discourse, science versus superstition, reason versus belief, innocence versus latent danger. The debates raised questions still relevant. How does society respond to what it cannot explain? What is the line between anomaly and omen, between moral panic and rational concern? And perhaps most hauntingly, how does a single human difference illuminate the deepest recesses of collective fear and imagination? Thomas Wren remained in every sense a child and a paradox. In the eyes of physicians, he was studied, measured, and analyzed. In the eyes of prophets, he was revered, feared, and morally weighted. London itself had become an experimental field, a theater of perception, where science, superstition, and human psychology collided. Each observer, each chronicler, and each fearful whisper contributed to a narrative that would outlive the boy, shaping folklore, ethical debate, and psychiatric speculation for generations. In this crucible of attention and interpretation, the tension between observation and belief, between knowledge and fear, became inseparable from Thomas himself. He existed at the intersection of the observable and the unknowable, forcing the city to confront its own anxieties, moral judgments, and the fragile limits of human understanding. Even today, scholars, mystics, and enthusiasts debate the significance of Thomas Wren's unblinking eyes. Was he merely a child with a rare physiological condition, or a harbinger of human fears and moral dilemmas? Were the odd events reported in London products of coincidence, suggestion, or supernatural intervention? And perhaps most chillingly, did society's own interpretation, its projection of evil, fear, and expectation, play a role in shaping the life of a child who had done nothing but exist? In examining the interplay between physicians and prophets, between reason and belief, we are reminded that human perception is not neutral, that the uncanny provokes both scientific scrutiny and moral anxiety, and that a single anomaly can illuminate the deepest uncertainties of a society. From the narrow, fog-choked streets of London to the dimly lit parlors of affluent households, the presence of Thomas Wren provoked reactions that ranged from awe to terror. As word of the unblinking boy spread, testimonies accumulated, each recounting strange, sometimes horrifying experiences that seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Witnesses, neighbors, servants, physicians, clergy, and even casual passers-by recounted moments in which Thomas's gaze penetrated beyond mere sight, as if he could peer directly into the heart of their intentions, their fears, and their concealed sins. One housemaid swore that when he looked at her, she felt a weight pressing upon her chest, an awareness of guilt she had not previously recognized. A local apothecary insisted that his cats refused to enter a room whenever the boy was present, their hackles raised and fur bristling as though perceiving some unseen force. In these early encounters, a pattern began to emerge. Thomas's eyes were described not only as unusual, but as instruments of revelation, capable of exposing hidden truths or stirring latent anxiety. Physicians, initially focused on neurological explanations, began to note behaviors that seemed to exceed the scope of simple physiological anomaly. In private consultations, they observed him anticipating questions before they were asked, commenting on minor mistakes or unspoken worries of adults, and demonstrating knowledge of events that by ordinary means he could not have known. Skeptical scientists sought natural explanations, acute observation, heightened memory, or the result of social conditioning in a child intensely aware of scrutiny. Yet even they could not dismiss entirely the impressions of his uncanny awareness, as several independent observers documented identical episodes that suggested some form of preternatural cognition. The contradiction between empirical expectation and witnessed phenomena became a central tension. Thomas could be rationalized as a prodigy with extraordinary perception, or he could be feared as a vessel of something beyond human understanding. Neighborhood folklore quickly filled in the gaps left by uncertainty. Street rumors circulated of Thomas foreseeing minor accidents or personal calamities, of his presence causing illness or sudden misfortune, and of animals and infants reacting with visible distress to his unblinking stare. These accounts were often embellished in retelling, shifting the narrative from personal experience to myth. Yet within these layers of storytelling, kernels of direct observation persisted. Reports from reputable individuals, physicians, school teachers, and merchants documented eerie coincidences that lent credibility to the more sensational claims. The tension between first-hand testimony and interpretive embellishment created fertile ground for a legend that thrived on ambiguity. Were these phenomena the product of fear, expectation, and human psychology, or did they signal an extraordinary, perhaps supernatural capacity within the boy? Letters, diaries, and personal memoirs of contemporaries provide additional texture, revealing how private reflection often diverged from public statements. A local vicar, for instance, wrote in his diary of visiting the Wren household and feeling an inexplicable chill as Thomas's gaze followed him, while publicly downplaying the experience as impressionable fancy. Servants recorded dreams in which the boy appeared, his eyes fixed upon them, revealing secret fears or foretelling events in cryptic symbols. Some testimonies are mundane yet equally telling. A merchant noted Thomas predicting the loss of a shipment days before it occurred, while a nurse recorded the child naming a hidden theft among her charges. These fragments, scattered across time and sources, illustrate the interplay between perception and interpretation, where subjective experience and societal expectation amplified each other, giving rise to a narrative that balanced on the edge of reality and myth. Even casual observers recounted encounters that defied conventional reasoning. Visitors to the Wren household, often strangers curious about the boy's reputation, noted immediate physical reactions: a tightening of the chest, a sense of unease, or the perception that Thomas was aware of unspoken thoughts. In some cases, social behavior appeared altered. A banker claimed he reconsidered an ethically dubious decision after meeting the child, attributing a sudden moral clarity to Thomas's presence. These accounts underscore the contrast between innocence and influence, the intersection of human psychology and anomaly, and the possibility that social interpretation alone can create outcomes that seem extraordinary. Whether the child wielded actual supernatural power or merely catalyzed latent human cognition remains a question that resonates throughout historical and psychological analysis. The reactions of children in particular highlight the duality of fear and fascination. Neighborhood youths reported conversations in which Thomas spoke of visions, disasters, and moral reckonings, often with precision and an unshakable calm. Adults, in turn, interpreted these remarks according to their own fears or beliefs. Mystical observers viewed him as a prophet, rationalists as precocious but explainable, and moralists as a moral test incarnate. In some accounts, he reportedly predicted minor fires, thefts, or misdeeds within the households he frequented, prompting both admiration and dread. The contrast between the child's apparent innocence and the magnitude of perception attributed to him created an unsettling dissonance, reinforcing his role as both participant and symbol in the moral imagination of the city. Psychologists studying historical records centuries later have noted that many of these encounters reflect classic patterns of projection and social amplification. Witnesses imbued Thomas with powers corresponding to their fears, desires, or moral anxieties, a process intensified by repeated storytelling and communal reinforcement. Dreams, letters, and testimony often reveal how personal and societal expectations shape the perception of his abilities. Some interpreted this as evidence of latent human fear of anomaly. A single biological difference, amplified by attention and narrative, could become the foundation for myth. Others contended that the boy's own cognition, unusually acute for his age, allowed him to exploit social cues, intentionally or unconsciously, reinforcing the perception of supernatural insight. The ambiguity extended into later adulthood, as stories circulated well beyond his immediate neighborhood. Folklore painted him alternately as a cursed child and a divine seer, emphasizing the duality central to his legend: innocence versus latent malevolence, reality versus interpretation, observation versus projection. Historical records preserve episodes that suggest both ordinary cognition and extraordinary awareness, but the impossibility of definitive verification ensures that the narrative remains unresolved. Survivors' accounts, whether in diaries, letters, or oral histories, convey both fear and fascination, leaving modern readers to wrestle with the same uncertainty that gripped Thomas's contemporaries. Through these encounters and testimonies, a complex portrait emerges. Thomas Wren existed simultaneously as a child, a symbol, and a moral touchstone. The interplay between direct observation and interpretive narrative created a social and psychological environment in which fact and folklore intertwined, amplifying fear, curiosity, and speculation. Testimonies of his gaze, dreams, and predictive abilities illustrate the human tendency to project moral and psychological significance onto the unknown, blurring the line between reality and legend. London itself, in these accounts, became a stage upon which innocence, perception, and fear collided, transforming the unblinking boy into a figure that could neither be fully understood nor dismissed. By examining these episodes, it becomes evident that the lasting fascination with Thomas Wren arises not from isolated acts or anomalies, but from the dense network of human response, interpretation, and moral projection that surrounded him. His eyes were a mirror, reflecting the hopes, anxieties, and moral dilemmas of every observer. The ambiguity of testimony, coupled with the oscillation between direct experience and mythic elaboration, ensured that every encounter could be read in multiple ways, sustaining both fear and fascination across generations. In this interplay, the distinction between what Thomas truly was and what society perceived him to be dissolves, leaving only the haunting, unresolvable question: how does humanity respond to what it cannot explain, and how much of the extraordinary lies not in the individual, but in the collective imagination that interprets him? Thomas Wren's unblinking eyes continued to fascinate centuries after his birth, provoking speculation that ranged from scientific inquiry to occult reverence. Historians and scholars have long debated whether the boy's notoriety stems from a genuine anomaly or from the collective imagination of a city primed for superstition. Medical historians often focus on physiological explanations: congenital insomnia, a rare neurological disorder affecting eyelid function, or heightened sensory processing. These interpretations aim to root Thomas firmly in the realm of science, framing his gaze as a biological curiosity amplified by attention and rumor. Yet even theserational accounts cannot fully account for the consistency and intensity of eyewitness reports. Tales of sudden illness, behavioral anticipation, or insight into secrets appear too numerous and corroborated across independent sources to dismiss entirely as coincidence or exaggeration. This contradiction between empirical plausibility and the persistence of legend forms the core tension sustaining fascination with Thomas's life. Occult interpretations emerged almost as quickly as reports of the unblinking boy spread. Prophets, mystics, and street preachers argued that Thomas's gaze pierced beyond the visible, revealing hidden truths, moral failings, or glimpses of future events. Some posited he was a vessel of divine insight, tasked with revealing human sin and guiding moral correction. Others insisted his eyes were cursed, a medium for malevolent forces acting in the city's hidden corners. Occultists often cited anecdotal evidence of fires, illness, or property misfortune coinciding with the boy's presence, emphasizing patterns they interpreted as supernatural signs. The persistence of such claims across generations ensured that Thomas's story was not merely a historical curiosity, but a living legend, passed orally, in diaries, pamphlets, and folklore, growing richer and more unsettling with every retelling. In the interplay of rational explanation and mystical interpretation, Thomas became simultaneously a subject of study and a symbol of the unknowable. Psychologists and social theorists approached Thomas from another angle, examining the role of human perception, projection, and communal fear in the development of his legend. They argue that extraordinary or unusual individuals often become mirrors for collective anxieties, magnifying latent fears into narratives that appear supernatural. Thomas, as a child who drew attention to himself through unceasing gaze, offered a canvas upon which neighbors, clergy, and strangers projected guilt, moral insecurity, or forebodings of disaster. Accounts of his gaze revealing secrets or inspiring fear in animals and humans alike are interpreted as products of expectation, suggestibility, and social reinforcement. Children's reports, letters, and diaries, when analyzed, often reveal patterns consistent with cognitive biases, memory reconstruction, and the amplification of minor coincidences into compelling stories. Yet, while psychological interpretation offers insight into perception, it cannot wholly eliminate the eerie, unexplained nature of the recorded phenomena, leaving space for continued fascination. Literary and artistic portrayals of Thomas further complicated the line between fact and legend. In the 19th century, pamphlets circulated that dramatized his abilities, sometimes depicting him as a prophet warning of societal decay, other times as a cursed child bringing misfortune to those around him. Poets and novelists drew inspiration from the boy, embedding the motif of the unblinking observer into moral tales, Gothic stories, and social commentary. Through literature, Thomas transcended his historical context, becoming a symbol of human anxiety about innocence, morality, and the unknown. Each retelling emphasized contrasts: childhood versus wisdom, innocence versus malevolence, reality versus imagination. The narrative elasticity of Thomas's story ensured that it could be adapted to fit cultural anxieties across centuries while retaining the core mystery of the unblinking eyes. The tension between science and superstition, rationale explanation, and myth finds its fullest expression in the ongoing debates among modern researchers. Some contemporary historians seek to reconstruct a coherent timeline from sparse documents, medical records, and witness accounts, emphasizing natural explanations for the boy's behavior and social reactions. Others, paranormal investigators, occult enthusiasts, and folklorists, analyze patterns in oral histories, letters, and diary entries, searching for evidence of extraordinary insight or supernatural influence. Online forums, social media, and academic discussions continue to echo centuries of speculation, illustrating that the need to impose meaning on unexplained phenomena is a persistent human drive. Each theory satisfies a subset of the audience, but none fully resolves the core questions, leaving Thomas's gaze metaphorically fixed on successive generations of observers, scholars, and storytellers. The story of Thomas Wren exemplifies the psychological and social mechanisms by which myth and history intertwine. Human beings cannot endure total ambiguity. Silence invites projection, and unexplained phenomena demand narrative closure. In Thomas's case, attempts at closure, whether scientific, mystical, or literary, serve to reinforce rather than resolve the mystery. Rational explanations illuminate some aspects of his life but cannot erase centuries of reports that suggest something extraordinary. Likewise, occult or supernatural interpretations offer narrative cohesion but rely on anecdotal, sometimes contradictory, evidence. The coexistence of multiple interpretations, each plausible yet incomplete, ensures that the story retains its haunting power, compelling audiences to question the limits of perception, morality, and understanding. Even today, Thomas's unblinking eyes continue to inspire reflection on human nature, social dynamics, and the interaction between observation and interpretation. Was he simply a child with a rare neurological condition, amplified by rumor and attention? Was he an unwitting mirror of social fears or an extraordinary anomaly that transcended ordinary understanding? Perhaps he was all of these things at once, a figure at the intersection of physiology, psychology, and cultural imagination. His story demonstrates that some mysteries are inherently irresolvable, and that the fascination with the unknown, fearful, moral, or cognitive, persists as long as there are witnesses to tell it, interpreters to speculate, and societies willing to grapple with the unnerving presence of what cannot be fully explained. Thomas Wren, the boy with eyes that never closed, remains a symbol, a challenge, and a question. How do we interpret the extraordinary? How much of legend is created by the anomaly itself, and how much by the humans who observe it? Each theory, scientific, mystical, psychological, literary, offers insight but not closure, inviting reflection on the human desire for understanding, the fear of the unknown, and the persistent allure of what lies beyond explanation. His gaze, unblinking and relentless, continues to haunt our collective imagination, a reminder that some truths may never be known, and that the intersection of fact, fear, and folklore can endure across centuries. Thomas Wren's unblinking eyes have endured through centuries as a chilling enigma, a phenomenon that continues to fascinate, terrify, and provoke reflection. The boy's life exists at the intersection of innocence and potential malevolence, rationality and superstition, biological anomaly and possible supernatural insight. Every account, whether a physician's report, a neighbor's diary entry, or a whispered folktale, reinforces the tension between what is observable and what is interpreted. Was he merely a child afflicted by a rare neurological condition? Or did his unblinking gaze signify something far more sinister or profound? The historical record provides no definitive answer, leaving each observer to wrestle with the discomforting ambiguity of his existence. London itself in the late 18th century seemed to react with awe, fear, and suspicion, projecting anxieties about morality, mortality, and human nature onto a single child who, in essence, had done nothing wrong. Some believe Thomas was simply a misunderstood child, caught in circumstances that magnified his difference into horror. To them, his eyes were no more than a biological anomaly, a medical curiosity, misinterpreted by a society eager to moralize, sensationalize, and fear what it could not comprehend. Others insist that he possessed insight or powers beyond ordinary understanding, a vessel through which unseen forces communicated, a being whose gaze penetrated human consciousness, revealing hidden guilt, secrets, or truth humans were never meant to grasp. The accounts of mystics and prophets, the reports of neighbors and street preachers, and the reactions of physicians all highlight the contradictory and multifaceted interpretations that surrounded his life. The boy became a canvas onto which society projected its deepest fears and fascinations, blending psychology, morality, and superstition into a narrative that remains unresolved. The silence surrounding Thomas's later life amplifies the mystery. Letters, rumors, and fragmented recollections suggest he may have lived quietly, misunderstood and marginalized, or that he may have retained the unblinking vigilance that had so-nerved observers perceiving truths beyond human comprehension. This ambiguity ensures that no single explanation can claim authority. The interplay between scientific investigation and mystical speculation, between witness testimony and rumor, continues to haunt scholars, historians, and enthusiasts alike. Ultimately, Thomas Wren's story challenges us to confront the limits of perception, the fragility of moral judgment, and the human impulse to explain the unexplainable. His gaze, unblinking and constant, forces reflection on fear, curiosity, and the unknown. It reminds us that some mysteries are enduring precisely because they resist resolution, compelling us to examine our assumptions, biases, and interpretations. The boy with eyes that never closed leaves us with a single haunting question: what do you believe?